Hi, and welcome back to part 3 of our read aloud of the graduation of Jake Moon. Hopefully, you've enjoyed the early chapters of the story. Not a super happy beginning. We've got at the very start Jake not defending his grandfather when Skelly was in the dumpster, and then we find out that Skelly, as we read in part 2, has been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. And that is a disease that affects the brain. It specifically targets the memory functions of the brain. And it's still in the very early stages, and they're still trying to figure out how this is going to affect Skelly, and we'll see how things play out after he couldn't remember Thorbert Piddler in the last chapter. That February, I was chosen class Valentine King. In Mr. Gooding's third grade, the Valentine King is the first boy in the room to hand in the Valentine's Day math assignment with no mistakes at all. The winner got to wear a king's crown at the party and joined the Valentine Queen in passing out all the cards from the Valentine box. The Valentine Queen was Lilla Lily. Lilla was a quiet girl with braces, so I had no reason to expect trouble out of her. But as soon as Mr. Gooding gave her that stupid crown, it must have gone to her head or something, because she knocked me out of the way, dug both arms into the box, and took about 90% of the valentines for herself. Then somehow she held out her skirt as a pouch for the cards, and she started dashing around the room like she was delivery queen of the world or something. Annoyed, I took off after her to discuss the matter. And okay, fine. I admit there may have been a bit of a scuffle, but still I don't think it was a big enough deal to make me forfeit my crown plus not get a Valentine cupcake. Anyhow, since Mr. Gooding was the kind of teacher who enjoyed calling parents at home at night, I thought it would be smart to tell Mom my side of the story before he squealed on me. Excuse me. And in another smart move, I decided to save my confession for the dinner table, where Ma was less likely to take a swat at me. But I had barely gotten to the part about Lilla Lily being Valentine Queen when Skelly interrupted. "We used to have an old dog named Queenie. Remember Queenie, Mavis?" he said. "She had pups in my sleeping bag one time." I frowned at him. "Yeah, that's great, Skell, but I really need to tell Ma about what happened at school today, okay?" My grandfather paid no attention to me at all. "Wait, hold it, I'm wrong. I'm thinking of Heidi." "Yeah, whatever, Skell," I said, turning back to my mother. "So anyway, when Lilla—" "Remember Heidi, Mavis? She had one brown ear and one white ear. Got her from the pound, only had 3 legs, remember her?" I could tell by Ma's face that something wasn't right here, but she didn't correct him. Suddenly, Skelly shook his head. "Nah, hold on again. That was my old friend Hiram Wickham, wasn't it?" I raised my eyebrows. What was this? Hiram Wickham had 3 legs? I started to ask what he was talking about, but Ma kicked me under the table. "Yeah, poor old Hiram. Had to have 2 of his dogs amputated. Ran over them with his lawnmower. Remember that, Mavis? The big dog and the little one?" Now I was stunned. Hiram had amputated his dogs? Quickly, Ma leaned in my direction and shook her head. "Toes," she whispered so that my grandfather couldn't hear. "Hiram Wickham ran over 2 of his toes, not his dogs." That night, after my mother and Skelly left the table, I sat there contemplating the horrors of Hiram Wickham and how completely mixed up Skelly had gotten. After she finished the dishes, Ma came over and tried to turn up the corners of my mouth with her fingers. I pushed her hand away. "He's getting worse, Ma. Tonight when he messed up, he didn't even know it. He didn't even catch himself." My mother smoothed my hair. Her silence told me I was exactly right. After she left, I went to the living room, and for the rest of the night I sat across from Skelly's recliner and watched him watch TV. I hardly blinked, hardly even moved. I thought maybe if I watched him close enough, he wouldn't have a chance to slip further away. Alzheimer's has 3 stages, and each stage is worse than the one before it. I don't know if any of the stages have, official medical names or anything, but in my head I think of them as 1, sad, 2, sadder, and 3, the saddest thing you've ever seen. Skelly's doc is a woman named Dr. Bloomfield. She told Ma and me that there's no set time period for how long each stage lasts, and that since not all patients have the same symptoms, you're never sure exactly when a person has passed from one terrible stage to the next terrible stage. The day I started 4th grade, I went to get a can of orange juice and found Skelly's pajamas in the freezer. Yeah, it might sound funny, but it was the second time he'd put them in there instead of the hamper, so I didn't get a big hearty laugh out of it or anything. A few days later, when I brought my new best friend, Lucas Carney, home from school, there was a little note on the freezer in Skelly's handwriting. It said, "This is not the hamper." Lucas looked at it and then at me. "Oh, it's just some stupid joke between Ma and me," I said. To distract him, I poured us something to drink. But just as I was handing Lucas his glass, we both noticed a piece of material sticking out the top of the oven door. Just as Lucas pulled it open, inside on the top rack were 2 wet sheets. "Is this another joke between your mother and you, or do you guys dry your sheets in the oven?" This time I started to stammer like you wouldn't believe. "Yeah, we do. I mean, no, we don't, but the thing is, our dryer broke this morning before I left for school, and Ma read in our oven book that if you're really in a bind, you can dry wet clothes in the oven." Lucas put his hand inside the door. "But it isn't even on." My mind was racing a mile a minute. "Yeah, I know. Of course it's not on. If you turn on the heat, the sheets would burn to a crisp. The book said the sheets are supposed to dry in their own natural juices." I closed the oven door and pointed Lucas toward my room. "Look, just go pick out a video game, okay? I'll be there in a minute." As soon as he was gone, I looked through the kitchen window and saw Skelly working in the yard. He was hunched over in the middle of the grass, pulling out weeds, it looked like. I hurried to the back door and locked it. Then I ran straight to my room and locked that door too. Skelly was still outside when Ma got home from work that afternoon. Lucas was gone by then, so as soon as I heard her car pull up, I ran out and tattled on my grandfather like he was a little kid. "You've got to talk to him, Ma. You've got to. He embarrassed me so bad today. He's not even trying. He's just being an idiot." After she heard all the details, my mother said she'd find a way to mention the sheets to him. But at dinner that night, Skelly was in such good spirits she didn't want to ruin his mood. Halfway through supper, he looked at me and snapped his fingers. "Oh, almost forgot, Jakey boy. Look what I found when I was digging out in the garden today." He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out one of my old Matchbox race cars. He rolled it to me from across the table. "It's always one of your favorites, wasn't it?" I turned it over in my hand. It was. It was the red Ferrari with the blazes of fire painted on the sides. He must have been polishing it up all afternoon. He'd even touched up the paint and gotten the rust and dirt out of the little tire rims. I thanked him and reached over to give him a hug. But as I did, my mind flashed an ugly instant replay of how I'd locked the back door so he couldn't get in. I kicked myself around pretty good over that too. But that's just how up and down and unpredictable our lives were back then. Just when you were sure Skelly had gone off the deep end for good, he'd start acting like his regular old self almost. Later, I asked Ma not to mention the sheets thing to him, but she told me she already had. But in a little bit of a breakthrough, she said Skelly had seemed willing to post more notes around the house to help him remember things better. The next morning when I got up, little post-it notes were taped all over the place. Like on the phone receivers were notes shouting, "Take message," and there were larger notes on the appliances, like a "Close me" sign on the refrigerator door and a "Turn me off" sign on the stove. Also, Ma had made Skelly a list of reminders, which she pinned to the bottom of his shirt. Things like 1, turn off the hose, 2, turn off stove burners, 3, lock the front door, and 4, wash goes in the dryer. She pinned the list upside down, so all he had to do was hold it out and read it. But as helpful as it was to him, it made me sad as anything seeing that list pinned to him all the time. He looked like some forgetful little kindergartner with a note from his teacher. Since my mother is an accountant, she was able to adjust her schedule to work from home during the morning and not leave for the office till noon. And she was home again at 4:30. Meanwhile, an older lady from across the street named Etta Gerber looked in on Skelly once or twice till I got home from school at 3:30. Etta came over again at 4 just to double check on the moon men, as she used to say. She thought that was a hilarious joke, by the way. She acted like she was the first person who had ever thought of it. Trust me when I say she wasn't. Usually when I got home from school, Skelly was either working in the yard or down in his basement workshop. All of his life, my grandfather had been a house painter. But after he retired, he started restoring old furniture and antiques. He was a real craftsman, too. Skelly could take some scummy old table that you wouldn't even want to touch, and in a month or two, he could have it looking like brand new. He always let me help him, too. Even when I was little and sloppy, if I asked to help, Skelly would stop what he was doing and teach me how to do the job right. He never made up some pretend little job for me just so I'd stay out of his hair like some dads do. And he wasn't afraid to let me mess up either. He always used to say, sometimes messing up is the best teacher. A couple of weeks ago, I was walking past this house down the street, and there was this little girl who thought she was helping her dad paint the porch steps. But even though her hand was on the brush, her dad's hand was right on top of hers doing the actual painting so she wouldn't slop it up. And I'm sure the guy meant well and all, but how's the kid ever supposed to learn, you know? When Skelly taught me how to paint, he showed me exactly how far to dip the brush in the can, and how to tap it lightly on the edge to shake off the extra so it didn't drip and run. Paid off, too. I was the only kid in my kindergarten class who didn't splat paint all over the room on the first day of art. Not one drop anywhere, I mean. I got my first happy face sticker for that. When I think about it, Skelly taught me a ton of stuff in that basement workshop of his. Sometimes he taught me stuff that he wasn't even aware of, I don't think. Like the first time I helped him sand a table. The two of us didn't talk for over 30 minutes, I bet. Just stood there working side by side, listening to the rhythm of the sandpaper as it rubbed back and forth across the wood. Even now, I still love that sound. We were excellent sanders, Skelly and me. We could sand a piece of wood till it was smooth as a baby's behind. That was one of his favorite expressions, by the way. Smooth as a baby's behind. Except he pronounced it behind with the accent on the B, which always made me laugh because it sounded particularly stupid that way. The last project my grandfather ever worked on down there was a scuzzy little table my Aunt Margaret bought at a yard sale. Aunt Margaret's one of those yard sale crazies you hear about sometimes. Like if you're having a yard sale that starts at 7, she's the one pounding on your screen door at 5 in the morning asking why the stuff isn't in the carport yet. She says she gets first dibs on all the bargain that way, but that totally kills me too, because in her divorce settlement, Aunt Margaret got so much money you can't even count all the zeros. Anyhow, as soon as she bought it, she brought the scuzzy table straight over to Skelly to refinish for her. And to make things even more unpleasant, she also brought over my scuzzy cousin James, who's a year older than me, who I've never liked, and who treats me like I'm gum on the bottom of his shoe. By the time Skelly and I walked out to see the table, James had already unloaded it onto the sidewalk. But even though it was out in the open air, I still had to hold my nose when I got close to it. I'm not kidding. The stink pollution coming from that little table was contaminating the entire neighborhood. I could not believe my ears when Aunt Margaret told James to pick it up and take it to Skelly's workshop. I let go of my nose and yelled, "No! Oh, geez, doesn't anybody notice that pukey smell but me? Come on, Aunt Margaret, at least let it air out for a while. There are people who have to live in that house." By this time, James had managed to get the table to the bottom of the porch steps. I ran over and grabbed the other side of it. "Put it down, James. We're not taking it in yet." James tried to pull it away. "Knock it off, joke." "No, you knock it off, lames," I said back. Then, still holding on to the table, I gave a hard push and shoved him backward. James tripped over his feet and the table fell on its side. That's when my grandfather came rushing over. There was nothing that annoyed Skelly more than when me and James fought. Which was always. "Lord save us, you two. Just give it here. I'll carry it to the basement myself." Angrily, he picked it up and hurried up the stoop. Aunt Margaret gave me and James one of her classic looks and told Skelly to be careful, and I followed them into the house. When they got to the end of the hall, my grandfather waited while my aunt opened the basement door and flipped on the light switch. I watched as Skelly hoisted the table higher in his arms and headed down. But instead of taking each step slowly, in his anger he was still going way too fast. Aunt Margaret shouted for him to slow down. I closed my eyes. He was still 4 steps up from the bottom when he fell. He broke his wrists. Both of them. But still, there wasn't one person in the emergency room that night who didn't go on and on about Skelly's wonderful good luck. "You're a lucky man, Mr. Moon," said the emergency room doctor. "You could have broken your neck in a fall like that." "His neck? He's lucky he didn't break his back," said the nurse. The x-ray guy was my favorite. He held up the pictures of Skelly's 2 shattered wrist bones up to the light and said, "You know, considering how far you fell, Mr. Moon, I'd say you got yourself a couple of lucky breaks here." He cracked up at his own stupid joke. When he looked at me to see if I was laughing too, I wasn't. I mean, excuse me, okay? But for an old man whose biggest joy in life is sanding old furniture, seems like 2 broken wrists are a pretty huge deal. And if the doctor or the nurse or the x-ray guy hadn't been so busy yucking it up, maybe they would have noticed my grandfather hadn't spoken 2 words to any of them. As we rode home in the car, I sat next to Skelly in the back seat. Every time I looked over at him, he was staring at his casts. He never took his eyes off them even once. And even days later, long after he should have been used to them, I'd walk into the living room and find him sitting in his recliner watching his casts instead of the TV. "Hey, Skell, what's up? Isn't there something you want to watch on the tube?" Then right away I'd start flipping through the channels trying to find a basketball game or something else he might like. But no matter what I picked for him, it wasn't long before his eyes would drop and he'd be right back to staring at those casts again. Dr. Bloomfield said she wasn't surprised by his gloominess. She said it was pretty common for Alzheimer's patients to get depressed after going through a trauma like his. She even warned us that the disease might start getting worse even faster. After a trauma, patients can become so overwhelmed it's almost like they don't have the energy to keep fighting anymore, she said. To try to lift his spirits, my mother and my aunt took him on picnics on the weekend. Other times, me and Ma would take him to the movies or out for ice cream, stuff like that. But regardless of what we did, the minute Skelly hit the door, he'd head straight for his recliner or his bed. To their credit, Aunt Ma and Aunt Margaret didn't give up. In fact, the week before his cast finally came off, my aunt brought him a small burlap sack with a big red ribbon tied around it. And inside were packages of flower seeds, all Skelly's favorites. She hurried into his room and woke him up. "Look, Dad, flower seeds. See them? Pansies, poppies, morning glories. I know it's still too cool to plant them outside, but I bought everything you'll need to get them started inside. Fluorescent bulbs, potting soil, it's all in the kitchen. You can grow them from seed and then transplant them into your garden as soon as it warms up." She showed him the pictures of the flowers. "Just a few more weeks and you'll be out there with your trowel digging in the garden, just like always." Skelly's eyes filled with tears. We thought it was because he was so happy that his troubles were almost over. But the next day when I got up, I found the bag of flower seeds in the kitchen trash where he dumped them during the night. Ma tried to shrug it off. "It was just too soon for him to think about all that. You mark my words, Jake. As soon as those casts come off, he'll be raring to get started." But 1 week later, when the casts did come off, Skelly was more worried about his wrists than ever. At dinner the first night, he wouldn't even carry a plate of spaghetti to the table. He said it was too heavy. And at breakfast the next morning, he had both wrists wrapped in brown socks, which was just plain disturbing. That afternoon, I dug out his old baseball glove from his closet and told him I'd like to have a catch. Just seemed like a good way to ease him back into using his hands again, I thought. "Come on, Skell. It'll be fun. We'll take it totally easy, I promise." At first, Skelly examined the glove like he was trying to figure out what it was. But when he finally looked up from me at his chair, his expression turned sour. "Catch? How exactly am I supposed to play catch?" He said the word like it was a bad taste in his mouth. Then he threw the glove on the floor and stood up. The next thing I knew, he was flinging his wrists in my face. "How am I supposed to do anything at all with bones as weak as these? Huh? Tell me that, will you? How am I going to do anything ever again?" As he turned and left the room, I heard him mutter, "Catch." And then he said some pretty bad stuff. Skelly had never sworn around me before. Never once in my whole life. With tears running down my face, I picked up his glove and took it outside. Then I lifted the lid off the trash can and slammed it straight to the bottom. 4 months after his accident, I woke Skelly up for dinner one night, and he asked me who I was. He said it like a joke almost. He'd been asleep on his bed, and when I tapped him awake, he said, "Who you?" "Yeah, right. Real funny, Skell. Ma says the pot roast is ready, okay? Can you smell it?" He squinted his eyes and studied my face. That's when I knew he wasn't joking. He didn't have a clue who I was. There's really no way to describe how terrible that made me feel inside, except to say that, to be honest, it's never really totally gone away. And even though there were times after that when Skelly knew me perfectly well, it became more and more common for me to walk into the room and have him totally baffled. Over time, Skelly finally settled on the idea that I was Claude Harper, his best friend from when he was a kid. And now, through the magic of Alzheimer's, his best friend once again. After my grandfather's accident, Ma took a leave of absence from work to stay with him for a few weeks. Then my Aunt Margaret stayed with him some too, but eventually both of them had to get back to work, and they hired a full-time caregiver. A caregiver is a person who takes care of sick people. The caregiver doesn't have to be a nurse, but ours was. Ours was a registered nurse named Lana. The reason I know she was a registered nurse is that it was physically impossible for Lana to say, "I am a nurse," without adding the registered part. Like anyone even knows what that means. My mother's work schedule had changed again. She'd gotten a promotion and was needed at the office in the morning. So for a long time, Lana came at 9 and stayed till Ma got home at 4:30. But by the middle of my 5th grade year, Lana started having problems, she said, with her daughter Vanna, and from then on she needed to leave our house at 3:30 sharp, she said, to pick Vanna up from school. Ma tried to hire someone to watch Skelly from 3:30 to 4:30, but no one was interested. So finally, I offered to fill in for a while. Didn't seem like it'd be a big deal, really. Most of the time I just came home from school and watched TV anyway. And Skelly was almost always asleep in his recliner, so how much of a pain could it be, I thought. And at first the answer was none at all. In fact, for the first month or so, it seemed like nothing had even changed. But pretty soon, stuff started coming up after school that I had to miss, and I began to resent it. Sure didn't help that Skelly's behavior kept getting weirder and weirder either. For one thing, he began roaming around in the middle of the night. Ma installed deadbolts and bells on all the outside doors to keep him from wandering away, but none of that stopped him from shuffling from room to room at 3 in the morning, turning on all the lights. Also, he began hoarding stuff from the kitchen. There were nights when I would hear him knocking around in the dark, and when I got up, I'd find him carrying cans of soup and vegetables down the hall to his room. He'd line them all up nice and neat on his shelf like the cans in a grocery store. When I asked him why, he always said he needed to have food in there just in case. Whatever that meant. Another thing that got worse was Skelly's repeating. One Sunday at family night dinner, he set a new world record by asking James and me if we liked lima beans 11 times. On the 12th time, James passed me an imaginary gun under the table and we pretended to shoot ourselves. So far, it's been one of our nicest moments together. Anyhow, even with all the confusion at home, I was still managing to have a life at school. Lucas Carney was still my best friend in 5th grade, so by then I had told him all about Skelly's Alzheimer's. Not like all the crazy business, I don't mean, but Lucas definitely knew my grandfather wasn't all there anymore. A couple times a week, usually, Lucas would come over after school and we'd shoot hoops in my side yard. We almost always stayed outside while Skelly napped in the living room, but once in a while we'd go into the kitchen for a drink of water or something. And on one of those trips, Skelly woke up and came wandering in to join us. His hair was all wild and fuzzy looking from the recliner, and he was only wearing one shoe. As soon as he saw Lucas, he pointed his finger and told him to zipper his brisket. I froze in embarrassment. Meanwhile, Lucas started backing up like a psycho had just entered the room. Finally, I managed to grab Lucas by the arm and steer him out the door. Jacket, I said as soon as we got outside. He meant to zip your jacket. It's just that Alzheimer's keeps erasing words from his vocabulary, and when he can't remember the right name for something, he just substitutes something else. Lucas rolled his eyes. Then why didn't he just tell me to zipper my coat? I mean, geez, Moon, a brisket's like a big hunk of meat or something. I started getting defensive. So what do you want me to do, Lucas? You want me to figure out a way for this stupid disease to make sense to you? That's just the way it works, okay? After that came this awkward kind of silence. Lucas grabbed the ball and started shooting again. So? I said finally. So what? So you gonna zipper your brisket or not? Lucas laughed a little and zipped up. There, now is everyone happy? And things pretty much got back to normal after that. But a couple of weeks later, when Lucas went inside to get another drink, Skelly called him Sylvia for some reason. From that day on, whenever he got thirsty, Lucas Carney drank from our outside hose. My resentment continued to build. I know it was only an hour a day that I had to stay with Skelly, but it turned out to be a big difference between coming home right after school because I wanted to and coming home right after school because I had to. The trouble was, Ma was all the time praising me like I was a saint or something, telling me how generous I was, giving Skelly an hour of my day. Plus, she was always saying how she would do everything in her power to keep the rest of my life as normal as possible. Cross my heart and hope to die, Jake. I'm going to hang on to normal if it kills me, she told me one Saturday morning. Then, to show me she really meant business, she went down to sign me up for Little League an hour before the doors opened. There were 2 baseball games a week that spring, plus 3 practices. But Ma insisted that getting me there would be no problem. It's just that Skelly would have to come with us now. Who knows, she said. Maybe getting him outside in the fresh air with all those young ball players, it might even do him some good. Skelly's always loved baseball. And he actually played on a senior league till he was 60, I think it was. And we still have the videotape of the time he took me to my first Little League game. It was the same day I took my first steps, actually. Ma said he was so proud of those 5 steps, he ran me straight down to the ball field where there was a game going on. My mother, who's always had the tendency to overtape my life, ran behind him with the video camera. As soon as the Little League game was over, she filmed Skelly carrying me around the backstop and standing me up on home plate. I fell down twice, but the third time I stood there all by myself for at least 10 seconds before I started to sway. Then just as I was about to keel over, Skelly came running into the picture, scooped me up in his arms, and zoomed me around the bases for my first home run. Unfortunately, when I played in 5th grade, Ma's wishful thinking about the fresh air being good for Skelly didn't exactly prove to be true. In fact, most of the time, as soon as she got him seated on the bleachers at a game, he was ready to go home again. Ma kept on bringing him, though. Whenever he got antsy, she would walk him around the track or the school parking lot. I know it was hard on her, and I know she tried her best, but twice during the season she got busy talking to someone in the stands, and Skelly climbed down and started to walk home by himself. Both times he took a shortcut through the infield. Both times it was in the middle of an inning. The guys on my team started calling him Mr. Magoo after that old man cartoon character with the bad eyesight who's always walking where he shouldn't. I just laughed. You kind of learn to do that by 5th grade. If you don't just laugh it off, they never stop teasing. The last inning of the last game of the season, for some completely unknown reason, my grandfather stood up in his seat and started shouting, "Cold beer, right here!" My team was at bat when it happened. I just walked out of the dugout and straight to the car. Never said squat to my coach or my teammates or anybody. Just walked to the car and waited for Ma to bring Skelly and drive me home. Thank God school got out a week later and I could just lay low for a couple of months. And that's where we will end part 3 of our Read Aloud. And for any of you listening to this story thinking, man, does Alzheimer's really make someone act like that, or is he just putting on an act or faking it? No, that's really how it works. And when you think about it, all of the things that you know how to do, like what word to use in a certain situation or using the right context, or knowing what behavior is appropriate in a different situation, those are things that you remember. You remember the right word. You remember the right way to act and what kind of choices are good and what kind of choices aren't. And as Alzheimer's affects the memory and you start losing some of that, Skelly doesn't remember the appropriate way to behave in certain situations anymore. So the things that he's doing, he doesn't understand that it's not right anymore. And we'll see how things continue to play out. And hopefully you notice Jake's personality is starting to take a little bit of a sour turn. Kind of snapping at things, and his resentment, he said, that bad feeling, blaming Skelly for all of his troubles, it's starting to build. So we'll have to see how that affects things moving forward. We'll see you back for part 4. Bye.